a lot of work engaging with stakeholders in the community. We have community engagement boards. We have local community funders. We visit the sites very regularly. It was harder during COVID, but we still continued with virtual meetings with those stakeholders to make sure that the project is reflective of what's happening on the ground, right? Good science, but also that it can be used by the communities to inform their efforts. And a good example is on our community stakeholder board, we have the, I'm going to get this wrong, Chief Medical Public Health Officer for the City of New Orleans, whatever that title is. And she, during the course of being on our board, or part of the advisory group, was also designing a maternal and child health strategy for the community. And so she asked us about some of the just basic data that we had on the health of the mothers and children, and also what they were saying in the community as a way of informing some of the planning she was doing. And we make a real commitment to making sure that the data are usable by the communities themselves. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back and start talking about poverty. And the first thing that I want to help you understand, for those of you that may not walk around with these facts in your head, is that poverty is something that varies a lot across countries. So this is a graph from the OECD, which is international data on poverty and child poverty rates across countries. This is a relative poverty rate, which means it's comparing how many children have less than 50% of the median income in a country. And as you can see, you can split it into fairly low rates of relative child poverty, intermediate rates, and then higher rates. The US is in that high rate of child poverty bracket. If you can see who has great eyes, who can tell me what's next to the US? Can you read it? It is, right? That is not typically the types of countries that we might think of ourselves next to in terms of our economic well-being and the strength of our economy. And one of the things that's interesting, I'm not making causal claims, but one of the things that's interesting is many other OECD countries, particularly those that are in the lower poverty bracket, are countries that provide cash allowances to new parents. So they're providing what's termed cash allowances, child allowances, to often every child in that country. And that alone, by providing that cash resource, reduces poverty for children in those countries. That is different than almost all of the countries that are in the high range. We do not do that. We have some very limited tax credits that are available to people who have that have high tax burdens. And so you want to think about the fact that poverty is not inevitable, right? It's not something that just exists in a country, but it's something that policy choices can definitely affect. And so I'm going to be talking about poverty as it exists in the US. And everyone I have learned, as someone who spends a lot of time talking about poverty, people walk around, if you're not steeped in the very academic literature, people walk around with different notions about what poverty is or what it means. Generally, people think it has something to do with income, but often they can make it much broader than that. And so I'm actually thinking about poverty in a relatively narrow way, which is a lack of financial resources needed to attain a minimal standard of living, right? And so that number, as is reflected in the federal poverty threshold, will differ depending on whether you have a very big family, right? You'll need more money to feed them, or a very small family, you might need less. And so the federal government back in I guess it was the 60s, when they were starting to think about the war on poverty, needed a way to measure poverty to see if any of their efforts were going to make a difference. And so there's a famous historical story about Molly Oshansky developing a way to measure poverty. And what she did is she said, well, we know that households spend about a third of their income on food. I'm going to take an adequate food budget and multiply it by 3, and that will be the federal poverty threshold. And since then, it's been updated. And now we do fancier things, which I won't get into. But the current federal poverty threshold for a family of 3 is about $22,000 a year. So hopefully you guys can think about what that would look like in your family or in your life, and whether that would be enough support to have a good apartment, a safe neighborhood, and access to the things that you need, like medical care, maybe childcare. Now, while I'm talking about poverty as something, amount of money that families may have, I want to be really clear that poverty is not an individual level phenomenon, right? So poverty is part of an economic structure that is affected by the opportunities that are available, that is affected by the structure of labor markets. We've seen some pretty big structural changes, right? So minimum wage is still 8, blah, 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 9 something, but many starting jobs are now paying 15 if you're going to Target, 17 if you're at McDonald's in Michigan, I can tell you, right? So the wages that you get, and most poor people in the United States are working people. I want to be really clear about that. People are poor because they have less economic opportunity. Their wages are lower, and they may work fewer hours. Who those people are that are earning low wages is also not randomly determined, nor is it purely an incidence of individual choice or willpower, right? So we have structures and institutions that reward some social groups and social identities much more than they do others. And as a result, people of color are much more likely to be in the situations of poverty and vulnerable contexts, not because of choices they've made, but because of structures that are part of our US system. And particularly, right, you don't have to look very far to the histories and experiences of trauma, racism, slavery, white supremacy, discrimination, and oppression. They are historically part of our country's history, and they continue to this very day. And that affects people's opportunity and their ability to earn wages, to work themselves into a higher income bracket. So I just always feel like I need to be really clear when I'm talking about individuals and the women in our study. It's not that they are poor, it's that we have a system, and in that system, they are the ones who have ended up being poor. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So, some literature review for your social science people that enjoy a good study. There are studies that try and look at a clever or quasi-experimental way to try and identify, not is income correlated with child outcomes, right? A cute story, when I was telling my father when I was in graduate school about how I was studying whether poverty was bad for kids, he kind of looked at me, he's like, don't we know that, right? It is something that within our country is rather obvious. But the questions persist, is it really the money itself, or is it other things that are associated with the money? And so there's been a good amount of correlational or observational research that will show these correlations. My colleague Greg Duncan has a fairly influential study using the panel study of income dynamics, which shows that a 4,000 difference in early childhood, so from, actually it's prenatal to age 3, will predict when people are 35 to 40, right, so many years later, will predict not only their educational, but also their adult earnings, time in the labor force, working, and health, right? That's pretty astounding at some level. So you're moving beyond just the correlations saying like, wow, something that happened 0 to 3 is now affecting how much you're working, your health, and your earnings much later in life. But again, there's a lot that can be associated with poverty that's hard to say, okay, it's poverty per se. So other people have tried to be really clever, and they have done very smart things, I will say. There was a great study that was ongoing in the Smoky Mountains, which is in Appalachia. And Randy Aki was smart enough to realize that at the time that the study was ongoing, it was just doing annual data collection on a cohort of youth, many of whom were in vulnerable families, that there was a casino built, a Native American casino built. And what this meant is that if you were in a Native family and could show your paperwork and prove it, your family got $5,000 a year, sort of all of a sudden. And that happened annually for several, it continues to this day, but it was happening annually for several years. So they were able to take advantage of the fact that this thing suddenly sort of rolled out, affected some youth in the area, but not all youth. And that He was able to show that that had similar effects on education, effects on labor market, and some effects on, they were used, so risky behavior, reductions in risky behavior. So that feels like a pretty solid study. But what we had realized is that very few of the studies, and I think I made this point earlier, were really focusing on early childhood. And so we wanted to say not just what would happen if you give income at any point in youth or middle childhood, but what about those early years when we know the brain is developing and is really quite sensitive to early experience? Maybe that is a unique time when providing supports to parents is really going to have a particularly strong impact on their children. And we say that because in the US, we also have, at the same time that's important for children, we have very few structural supports for parents. So, do we have federal universal paid leave? No. Do we have cash support? No. Do we have universal provision of paid childcare? No. So the struggle is real. For those of you that are not yet parents, keep this in mind. It takes a lot to juggle having enough income to take care of basic needs and being able to be present and care for a child. And so we thought this is a time not only when the brain might be particularly susceptible, but also when families are actually in great need of support, maybe even more so than when kids later on are in school and don't need constant attention. So that is the study we decided to set up. We really wanted to say, what is the causal impact of poverty reduction? And we wanted to know this in two ways. So would it affect children's healthy development, and particularly their brain functioning? We have neuroscientists on the team, so they understand this better than I do. And also, how is it affecting? If it does affect children's health and development, how is it going to affect families? What are we going to learn about how families may be better able to care for their children? We're using a randomized clinical trial, like they do in the field of medicine, and it's funded. And so therefore, we're also very committed to open science, in part because the NIH has told us we need to be very committed to open science, but we are. And so we're going to look at a lot of outcomes, and one of the things they want you to do is tell the world, literally, before you do any analyses, before you collect any data, what do you expect to find? And that keeps us from being able to be like, oh, I knew we'd find that, when you get an unintuitive finding. And we have a few of those. So there are two pathways, and I'm going to present results from our study from each of these two pathways. So I'm going to spend a little bit less time here and a little bit more time when I actually get to our data. But there's two main theories about how, and these are well known in the literature, we did not make these up, about how income and an increase in income or a reduction in poverty might lead to better child health and development. And the first one is simply an increased investment. It turns out money can buy things that might be good for kids. No, it's true. So it can buy a better apartment, which might not have lead, paint in it. It might have less air pollution. You might be able to buy better childcare, better nutrition, a whole range of safety and enriching things that are good for kids' development. So that's one pathway. The other one is it might enable parents to be more responsive and interactive with their children, be more present with their children, talk to them more. For those of you that are early childhood people out there, talk to them more, read more books with them, because they maybe are worrying less about money. And so one of the things we know about trying to make ends meet with a few resources is that it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of mental work to figure out how you're going to pay for something, where's the next dollar going, how are you going to, a car breaks down, well, how is that going to get fixed? And if you can't fix it immediately, which buses are you going to take to get to the place that you have to be? So having some additional money might actually relieve that pressure and that stress, and might improve mental health, and that all could lead to better interactions, all generally family interactions, but also with the child that's young. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about us getting into the field, because we're now 10 years into trying to get this off the ground. It took 5 years for us to build the study out to be what it is. So the first thing that we decided is that often when you're trying to study a low-income community, you can have trouble actually literally getting to the people that you're hoping to work with and partner with, so to participate in the study. And so we decided that we were going to take a book out of the page of the Fragile Families, which is now the Families Forward. They've rebranded themselves because that was a negative name. So the Families Forward study, which had wanted to study unmarried parents and had stumbled across the idea, I'm making it sound like it was fake, they probably studied this for a long time and had a brilliant insight. But they realized that if you went to a hospital room, most fathers would show up in the hospital room, and 98% of births happen in a hospital room. So if we wanted to recruit new mothers with an infant, we were like, we will go to the hospital rooms. And that is what we did. And we did that because going to a WIC clinic or a prenatal health clinic would miss moms that were not actively engaging in healthy service provision, right? And that's only a slice of those who may be low income. So we wanted plausibly diverse. Now, flip side, for those of you that do research, you know it's really hard to do this in a geographically spread out way. So we landed in urban areas and had to have hospitals that would allow us in to recruit. So we are not really nationally representative, and specifically are missing any rural families, so we're in urban areas. We did want geographic diversity and cost of living. And so given what we needed, which was support from local governments, a local neuroscience collaborator who could help us with the EEG measurement and staffing of labs, as well as funding. So we looked to local foundations who would be able to help fund the cash gifts in particular, because it turns out that philanthropy in, say, New York City might not care so much about the well-being of people in a different state. So there were a lot of puzzle pieces that it took us 5 years literally to put together. But in the end, we were able to get all of these things. So we were able to get into the safety net hospitals. We worked closely with state and local governments to get protection so that our families wouldn't be losing benefits that they might otherwise be eligible for. So just a quick example for those of you who don't know, if you receive food assistance and your job gives you a $300 raise, they will cut your food assistance by $100, essentially, something along those lines. So we didn't want that to happen because then it's a test of substitution, cash, but cuts on benefits, and we wanted an overall estimate of the impact of cash. So any questions on that? This is always the fun part. It was hard. I mean, we had legislation passed in states. We were constantly on the phone. We had no funding, right? We're doing this for 5 years without any funding. Which I think tells you how much we felt like this was an important study, but it is also to say, don't give up. Don't give up, just keep trying, keep knocking on doors. I think we talked to probably 12 different states. We were trying, for a long time, we thought we were gonna get Colorado on board, but they came back and said no. So let's just keep it up. But, woo-woo, in 2018, we were able to launch, and we did recruitment over the course of a year. We were in 12 different hospitals in 4 metro areas. So we were always in more than one hospital, but the number varied depending on the location. So New Orleans, Omaha, Nebraska, the Twin Cities, and New York City. Okay, so we had staff that were in the hospital who would check with the nurses about who had given birth, and they would go into a room and do a screening form that asked about household income and a few other things. So we're only able to enroll mothers who were speaking Spanish or English because of the assessments we were hoping to do with the children were not available in other languages. We screened on whether it was a healthy birth, so it was in the well child nursery. And then there were some cases in which the nurses would say, we really don't think you should approach this room, right? And so that would be instances of significant health problems for the mother. Sometimes we were looking at the child being taken by Child Protective Services, or even just the mother having significant cognitive problems. So there was a little bit of nurses saying, don't go to these rooms. But at the end of it, we had 1,000 low-income mothers. And the way that we approached them, and we were very careful about coercion. So you never want to be offering people for whom money is important a large amount of money to participate in research. That is like IRB, human subjects 101, don't do it. So the way that we did it is we first asked mothers if they'd be willing to participate in a study about the development of their children and family life in some general terms. They took a survey, a 30-minute baseline survey, demographic survey, and then afterwards we said, oh, and you have the opportunity to be part of this lottery. And the lottery will mean you get one of two levels of income. So we actually had 53 moms who said they didn't want the lottery, and then we said, thank you for your time, paid them for their survey, and did not put them in the lottery. But we were able to get a full 1,000 who said, yes, please sign me up. 600 of them received $20 on a debit card. So we actually, another piece of our work was trying to find a vendor who would allow us to give out a debit card that could get customer support in both Spanish and English and would not charge us an arm and a leg to do this. And so we landed on a company called Greenfire, which actually does a lot of medical trial payments on debit cards. When they got randomized, we immediately activated the card and loaded the money, gave them information about it, gave them a helpline number that's on the card, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then they were free to go. It's unconditioned. They can use it in any way that they want. We also, as part of the study, we have a qualitative sub-study, which is going to expand to all 4 sites, but is currently just in the New Orleans and the Twin City area, and that is waves of semi-structured interviews, where we're much more open-ended conversations with the mothers about what the money means to them, what their parenting goals are, what are the stresses and challenges they face in their lives. It's really a broad range of topics that's meant to let us understand in their words what their experiences with the money is, the cash gift, and a range of other things. So when we planned the study, we were like, great, we think it's the first 3 years of life. We're gonna bring kids at age 40 months, bring kids at 36 months into a laboratory, get a full battery of child assessments. That sounds a little cold, but they're fun games that you play with kids. Yeah, they're learning games. We make them fun. And then we'll stop the cash payments at 40 months. And to us, that seemed reasonable because I'm pretty sure we had to have raised $6.7 million just to give away in cash, right? And so would we have liked it to go longer? Sure, but like that's more fundraising that we have to do and seemed hard to do at that moment. Fast forward, we're 2/3 of our way through data collection in the first year of when the child is 12 months old. So we're up and running, and then COVID, right? And COVID did many things. It stopped in-person data collection. And so basically, we fairly quickly realized that, well, maybe in a year, we realized we're not going to be able to get these moms into a laboratory at 36 months because the universities themselves were not on board with doing in-person research yet and weren't going to tell us when they would be okay with that. And we worried that even if they would allow for it, that these were vulnerable communities, right? So many communities were not feeling safe, even if maybe someone was telling them it was safe to be in person. So we were lucky that we were able to go back to our funders and say, hey, can you extend the payments longer? And they said yes. We were able to get some extension money from NIH because of COVID. And then as this kept going on, we realized that there was enough appetite because it coincided with a lot of questions and debates about cash benefits, both from basic income programs and then also from the child tax credit, which had been a large program that had provided cash support to families on a regular monthly basis, that there was much more appetite among our funders. And so we've actually gotten to the point where we're extending the payments through 76 months. That's just after age 6. And we'll now have all of early childhood. So we won't be able to tell you about just 0 to 3, but we'll be able to tell you about what the cash support means for all of childhood. Now, at the same time, inflation has crept in. And we didn't fundraise for $333 plus CPI adjustments for cost of living increases. So it's the same amount, but we'll now go through first grade-ish. Okay, I gotta go fast. Who's in our sample? So the first thing, if you're running a randomized controlled trial, you care a lot about the groups you're comparing being similar, because that is what allows you to compare the groups and say, when we first met them, they were exactly the same or very close to exactly the same. So now, when I'm looking at them a year, 2 years, 3 years later, the only thing that differs between these groups is the cash money that they've been getting, the different amounts. And so we're happy we succeeded in having baseline balance on their characteristics. As I talked about with racial disproportionality and poverty, it's probably not too surprising that given the hospitals and communities we're in, we have largely a sample that are women and families of color. So we're about 40% Black and about 40% Latina. Now, the communities themselves are very different. So it is very different to be Black in the Twin Cities than it is in New Orleans. And similarly, and we have a significant amount of diversity within the Latina population. So our New York sample is mostly Dominican. And in the other sites, it's largely Mexican and some Honduran. About a third of the mothers are foreign-born. 25% of them elected to do the interviews in Spanish. So that suggests that that's their most fluent language, because that's how we determined. About only 20% of mothers are married. That may seem high or low to you, but about 40% are living with their partner. The rest are living either by themselves or with other family members. Many of them said they were going to go back to work or start working after they had their first child. The average household income, and that's what we looked at the household poverty as a metric for being eligible for the study, and they had to report a household income that once you added the baby, which had been born that day, would give them an income lower than 100% of the federal poverty threshold. So it's a sample of poor mothers, and again, no surprise, 95% of them were receiving government benefits at the time of the child's birth. Yes?
What was the average age and standard deviation?
Great question. I think it's about 25, and there's maybe a 1.5 to 2 year standard deviation. We could not take mothers that were less than 18 because of their ability to participate in consent, because they are not age of consenting. It was not everyone's first birth, is the other thing to know. So I think on average, there are 2 children in the families, including the new child. We are collecting a tremendous amount of data and different things. So we had our recruitment, which was really just a baseline survey. At age 1, we went into the homes. We were doing an in-person data collection. We were videotaping mother-child interactions. We were getting mothers' hair samples so we could measure stress hormone, hair cortisol. We were asking moms about language. And in a technology is amazing and wonderful moment, literally months before we were going in to collect data, like 4 months before, we learned that there was a portable electroencephalography system. So electroencephalography measures brain waves. So it's like the activity of your firing brain waves. And it's the nets. I have pictures that are coming, but it's like the nets that go on people's heads. And those nets act as microphones, and they amplify the activity so that we can measure it. And then neuroscientists, and I'll come back to this later, neuroscientists could do all sorts of cool things with it. It had not existed as something that you could do outside of a laboratory until 4 months before our study, where a Portuguese company had developed this. So we jumped on that, and we were literally in people's homes putting cute little nets on their children's heads and measuring the brain activity as they watched a video of Baby Shark. But we have a tremendous amount of data, and at age 2 and age 3, it was really just a survey, a phone survey because of COVID. We are collecting administrative data from states when we were given consent by the mothers. We have access to point of service information about how they are, where they are spending the money and how much they're spending the money that's on the debit card. Quick plug, we have data from baseline through age 2 currently publicly available. It's been de-identified, but it has almost all the other, except for the super identifying sensitive data. It is available for anyone to download from ICPSR at the University of Michigan and use. So if you have a question that these data can answer, if you need to write a paper, if you're a graduate student, we'd love for you to use these data. And we provide really good data documentation. It takes us a really long time, and I get cranky, but I can tell you the data is actually well documented. Currently, we're coming up on the end of our age 4 in-person data collection again. So we have children coming into laboratories in these 4 sites. Moms are getting a short survey. We're redoing the electroencephalography, this time in a lab setting. It has more progs that go into the head, so we get more nuanced brain activity data. And then we're doing a battery of child assessments that get at cognitive skills and language skills and behavioral measures. And we are getting some biophysical markers as well. We had started out collecting hair again, but actually put the kibosh on that because so many kids had had their hair done around their 4th birthday, and moms were not willing to let us undo a little bit of the hairdo to get their hair. Okay, so there's a lot of data, and we as a team will only ever be able to analyze a good chunk of it. So I really do want to encourage people to use it. Let me tell you a little bit more about the cash that we're giving out. So it's on this debit card. This is what it looks like. It's branded as For My Baby. We have so far dispersed, so by the time we get to the end of the 4th year, we are like 4 months away from that, we'll have given out $10 million to families on these cards. We ask for permission if we can look at their point of service data from credit cards, from it's like what you get on your credit card bill. It doesn't tell us what they bought. It tells us how much they spent and where they spent it. So that's useful, as you'll see in a second, but isn't super detailed. It has also, just FYI, made me not trust credit card companies. So never feel like you shouldn't dispute something that you don't fully understand on your bill. It's messier behind the scenes than I realized. I had not expected that. Yes? We felt like it was important for everyone to get something. And the amount that we landed on of the 333 was close to that. If you add it up over 12, it's pretty much $4,000, which is close to what some of the correlational research had suggested might be important. It also is not that far off from a maximum benefit for like an EITC or some other assistance programs. So one funder who didn't want to fund our project came back and said, it was New York City based, maybe not a surprise. They're like, $4,000 is not nearly enough. Like, this is crazy. You need to give them at least $12,000 a year. I totally get that, and that might be the final answer, but also that meant we had to then fundraise $12,000 for every family for every year. So we tried to be practical about what seemed like a policy relevant amount that prior literature suggested might matter from EIT studies or other studies. So the nice thing, and what we'd like to remind people is, well, it took us a really long time to figure out how to do it. Giving cash away on a debit card is fairly efficient, right? The mothers have the money, they use the card. If they lose the PIN or lose the card, there's a helpline that they're able to find us and they call. It works fairly smoothly as interventions go. And we make this point because a lot of types of interventions that focus on low-income families are much more time-intensive, right? You're requiring parents to come in for parenting classes, or they're having to show up for workshops. So this is a really efficient way of providing support, assuming that it works. And they like it well enough to use it. So there are some moms that we see saving it, but by and large, it is spent very quickly after it's loaded on the cards. So knowing the point of service allows us to characterize the types of places that mothers are using the card, not what they're spending it on, but the types of places they're using the card. About a third of the transactions are seen at ATMs, right? So you can also use it at ATM. So they're withdrawing cash. There's lots of reasons, lots of ways in which people might use cash. So that's one of the largest. The second one is big box stores and wholesale stores. Target, Walmart, those types of places. And a fun tidbit from the qualitative data during the pandemic was that having a debit card for mothers, this was a mother in New Orleans, opened up the ability to order things online. right? So they hadn't had a debit card before or they hadn't had a card. And so they were always going to the corner store to buy or the gas station to buy whatever it is they needed. But in the pandemic and in that context, they were able to order things to their home, which also has lower prices because a lot of the corner stores, bodegas, gas stations charge more for home products. So you can see, as much as ATM and big box stores, there's a lot of other ways in which they spent it. We've seen it on drugstores, we see it cable internet, we've seen it phones, all sorts of things, which is also how the rest of, or most people spend their money. It goes in lots of different directions. We've been really incredibly lucky working with the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan. They know how to field studies very well, even for challenging populations that maybe are quite mobile. We have been able to reach at each of the 3 waves of surveys, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, at least 90% of both groups. That's fairly, you guys do not look at all impressed. It's impressive. You're all kind of like, okay, great. I'll move on. We've had a really high, and so the reason that that's important is because if we're comparing these 2 groups, and the whole premise is that they're similar, you don't want to have lost a lot of people and then be facing like, well, maybe they're not similar anymore. Maybe they're different. We do a lot of checks to make sure that attrition and all that stuff doesn't affect our estimates. And it doesn't, primarily because we have so many of these mothers still in the data set. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. So this is some of the technical details of how we do the analysis. What I will say is that essentially our analytic strategy is to compare the 2 groups. We have a bunch of measures that they reported when they're in the hospital doing the baseline survey. We adjust for those. We worry also about the fact that we have so many outcomes, right? Like when you're measuring, 200 things, you're going to get some things that pop up as being significantly different by chance. And so we use approaches where we group outcomes by families and try and make family-wise adjustments. For the technical people, I'm happy to answer questions about that. We also do a variety of more sophisticated non-response weights and multiple imputation. Again, because we have so many mothers staying in the sample and have so much data, none of these adjustments or robustness checks make any difference for our findings. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into findings. You guys have been patient, thank you. The first set of things I'm going to talk about are related to the money and the investment pathway. This is a slide actually that my co-author Lisa Janetian wrote, so I'll not probably do it as well as she will. But the investment pathway really comes out of an economic perspective that thinks about the fact that parents trade off money and time with kids, right? So those are 2 resources. When people say money is time, that's literally true, right? That's money that that's time that you could be working or that you could be spending with your child. And so we tried to think about what are the trade-offs of giving cash. And typically that has meant that economists worry that you're going to work less hard to get other sources of income, whether that is other benefits or take time and stepping out of the labor market or working less. So we were interested in those outcomes. And it's possible, right? This is not what we found, but it was plausible that we would give people $4,000 a year and that maybe other things would change in their income and they would only end up with a net of, say, $1,000 or $2,000. And then we wouldn't really be reducing poverty very much at all, right? We'd be substituting one income source for another. And as it turns out, that's not really what happened. We actually were able to reduce poverty. Nonetheless, when you add in the cash gift to what mothers are reporting in terms of household earnings and other sources of government income, we are not bringing people well into the middle class. I hope that's I think that makes sense when you think about what $4,000 might do. So we reduced poverty by 14%, the gap there. We did see slight decreases, very slight decreases in maternal earnings and other adult earnings. You can sort of see, so the way to read this is the high cash gift group earned $26 less than the comparison group. Okay, does that make sense? $28 less in terms of other adults that were in their household, $10 less of government income, $7 for other miscellaneous. So their net gain from that 333 in terms of income, like cash income, was $252. All right? That's per month. Yeah. And this is pooled over 3 years, so averaging across all 3 years. I should have said that. So another interpretation of that, this is the same figure, but now we're adding in that difference of $61. So 26 plus 28 plus 10 plus 17 is 61. So it's about, for every dollar of unconditional cash, they lose about 20 cents of reduction of income. Not lose net, or they don't net an additional 20 cents. Does that make sense? So there's a little slippage. But compared to what some economists might have predicted, and I know there's not too many of you in the audience, but they might have said there'd be much more substitution and that you'd see much greater reductions. But we did not see that. In our data, about half of the moms are working for pay in that first year and subsequent years of their children's life. We see very, very small and selective decreases in employment. So providing mothers with this cash gift did not drastically change how much they were working. What we saw mostly was reductions during 2021 when COVID was strongly still going, and it's reductions from 40 hours to maybe just working 20 hours. And literally it's like 4 to 5 percentage points less of work. We see no differences between the groups in non-parental care. Very few families have their children in center-based care. It's primarily home-based care or informal care. In part, it's just way too costly, even with financial assistance from states. Interestingly, we see that about 15% of, by wave 3, about 15% of the mothers are reporting that they have completed additional credentials or courses of schooling, right? So it looks like they might be using the resources in a way that would help them invest in their own future in terms of education. We don't see any differences in maternal sleep or sleep quality. That's really a marker of health. We thought there might be some differences in health. But we do see that nearly all the moms are spending additional time in early learning activities with their children. Okay, so we asked them about a variety of activities, and I'm going to slip forward and then go back. We asked them, so we see increases in spending on children and increases in time spent in these early learning activities. And so the hashed or checkered green is what the control group is reporting. And so you can see that, for example, if you look at the books, they're reporting spending a little over $20 a month. This is a month and the prior month on books for their children. And then you can see about another, I think it's $14 being spent by the experimental group. So they're spending more and a significantly larger amount. And you see this for a variety of child-specific expenditures: toys, activities, diapers, and electronics, right? Suggesting that the families or the mothers are thinking about the money as money that should be spent on the kids. Maybe not surprising, but we gave it at the time of the child's birth and branded it For My Baby. At the same time, we see them spending slightly more time in these early learning activities too. So on average, again, the learning activities with the green check is the amount that the control group is spending or the comparison group is spending altogether. They're spending about 70 minutes a week, they're reporting, in these early learning activities. And we see about 10% more minutes being reported by the experimental group, the high cash gift group, sorry. Now, I told you we had a qualitative study, and I think that's been really helpful in helping us unpack that. So one of the things that has come through really strongly from Sarah Halpern-Meakin's work with listening to the mothers and reading the transcripts is that child's money doesn't always mean that they are spending it specifically on the children, okay? So it can mean a lot of different things, and I think a good example of that is a mother who talks about using money to buy cleaning supplies because she wants a safe environment for her children, and she knows that if it goes uncleaned, the dog is dirty, and those types of things. So even if it's sort of mentally earmarked as children's money, that can still mean a broad set of things that they're purchasing. Nearly all of the mothers do worry about money quite a bit, and they see the cash gift as a blessing. Some were using very religious terminology, a gift from God, a tremendous relief and blessing. And they also talk about it as enabling new possibilities for them. So we see moms that start very small but meaningful side hustle gigs. So one of the mothers used it to buy fabric, and she started a business selling tutus to other, online to people. So again, but to her, the idea of having her own business or her own, being in charge of her own venture or next step was critically important. And also important is that this is seen as a program that is different than other government, and not other, but different than government assistance programs. So they see this as less paternalistic, less regulated than something like WIC, than something like food assistance, which they have a variety of experiences with, some positive, but also some negative. And so the unconditional nature of the gift is seen as something that sets it apart from many other public assistance programs. Now I'm going to talk about the stress pathway. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I will simply say there is a long history for those of you that are human developmentalists, Rand Conger, all the folks going back to the Great Depression who were studying how economic hardship affects families. They've come up with elegant models that essentially say economic hardship creates economic pressure, right? So you have less money, you have more trouble making ends meet, paying bills, taking care of things. And that creates the parents to be psychologically distressed. They don't always use mental health language. I think now it's probably more likely that they would, since we all talk about mental health more regularly. But it's the idea that having the financial stress creates stress in family relationships, so it creates stress with partners, right? You might be fighting about money, you might be fighting about what to do, and that reduces parental, or it's often studied in terms of parents, at least initially, but partner relationships, it puts strains on that. And that in turn sort of floods down to the child, creating less warm and nurturing interactions with children, more stress, and often more discipline, more harsh discipline with kids. You're sort of, for any of you that have been in that really stressed parent moment, you might imagine that. So that's the model and the types of outcomes we were interested in looking at. Now, I'm going to show you these impacts in a little bit of a different way. So one of the challenges we have in communicating the findings is that all these scales are on different metrics, right? So the nice thing about the graphs I showed you before, it was like minutes. You know what a minute is, right? Dollars, you know what a dollar is. Does anyone know what a 1 point difference on the perceived stress scale is? No. So we've standardized all our measures, which means essentially we've divided by a standard deviation. Right? So those of you that love your stats like I do, 2/3 of the population falls within one standard deviation on either side of the mean. And so we put everything on the same metric so you can kind of compare across in terms of magnitudes of effects. And I'll try and, please ask questions and I'll try and walk you through. So what we're going to show you is a set of bar graphs that look like this. This one is probably not the greatest example, but I've already told you we reduced poverty and increased income. And what I want to show you is in this set of outcomes, we have a bunch of outcomes within an area, right? And I told you we wanted to worry about family-wise. So I'm showing you two sets of confidence intervals, which will tell you whether the difference is significant or not. If the line crosses the 0 bar, it is not different than 0. But there's two lines. You can hardly see it. There's a little nubby line and then a thick line. The family-wise, which is the more conservative approach, is the thin line. And the thick line is just if you were treating each outcome as an individual outcome, not as part of a family. I see, Laura, you have frowning. Do you want me to clarify that? No, I just couldn't see that little nubby line. Yeah, it's actually quite small in this one. The other thing that I'm going to tell you is some of the things you want more of, you want more money. So our hypothesis is positive, right? You want more of it. And the N is the number of subjects or the number of respondents. Part of the thing is like we had some things in wave 1, but not in wave 2. So there's a little bit of variation, and I'm showing you pooled across all timelines. But you want to think about what the direction should be. And so what we tried to do is this is blue. Blue, and I'm sorry if people are colorblind. We tried to get high contrast stuff. Blue is good, right? It's in our hypothesized direction. But when you get to something like stress, you don't want more of it, you want less of it. And so, so there'll be a negative there, and then I'll just get to it, you guys. Okay, what do we find? First of all, for economic pressure, this is things like food insecurity, right? Do you have enough food to eat, enough of the types of food that you want to eat? We would have expected that food insecurity would go down. You would be more food secure. So it should have been on the other side of the zero. It is red because it is actually showing that those in the high cash gift group are not different than those in the low cash gift group, but the point estimate, which is not significant, is in the wrong direction. Okay, it's suggesting, if anything, they're more food insecure. Non-economic hardship is, have you had to skip a bill? Have you missed rent? Have you had lights turned out? Again, we would have thought less of this would be good. Less hardship is good. If anything, we see more, but again, it's not different than zero. And then we had a one item that asked people if they were worried about their expenses. Same pattern. So this is where open science comes in. We did not hypothesize that these point estimates would be in this direction. It's true, they are hitting zero, so they're saying they're the same as the other group. Poverty went down. We don't see reports of economic hardship improving, going down. All right, same thing here. We hypothesized that there would be less stress, less parenting stress, potentially less depression, less anxiety. We have two different measures, and this is where the ends become useful. And then we have a small number that we got a hair sample for at age 1. In all instances, it's not different from the group with the exception of the parenting stress. And in all instances, it's going against our hypothesized direction. Okay, I'll let you take that in for a minute. And some are measured more precisely than others. And now we get to parents' relationship quality. Remember, we talked about parenting. And here we're looking both at co-parenting, because you may be co-parenting with someone whom you're not romantically involved with, and also have a romantic relationship. For the two that we would think better is good, we actually see it again in the opposite direction, although not significantly different. And for those that we think less would be good, less arguing, less physical hurting, it goes in the opposite direction. Yes, those forehead burrows are exactly how we thought when we saw these data. Now, we also looked at parenting quality, and we had a parent report. I've already told you about the parenting activity, and this is the same set of measures, but this is just standardized on an effect size rather than showing it to you in minutes. It is positive and significant, so that remains. We also had measures of the quality of parent-child interactions in terms of learning and warmth. That came from coding videotapes that we took at the time on a free play task. And then we also asked moms about spanking. These are all going in the right direction, but those last two are not significant. It's only the child activities that are significant. Okay. So I told you that right before we were heading into the fields for that 12-month visit, we rolled out the ANOBO electroencephalography measurement of brain activity while kids were watching Baby Shark. What neuroscience, and I am not a neuroscientist, but I have learned from my neuroscientist collaborator. So what neuroscientists do with that data that they have collected is they process it and they break it down into different bands of oscillation of speed. And the patterns that they have seen when they're doing neuroscience EEG studies across the SES spectrum is that they see more slow speed activity in lower income children and more high speed activity bands in higher SES children. High speed activity is associated with the activation of your brain, so it's like being focused, alert, engaged, and slow speed is more akin to being sort of sleepy, not alert, relaxed, if you will. And so what we hypothesized is in the blue. We thought that the high cash gift group would have less slow activity, and that's in the theta in particular. Alpha's close to that, but less theta, but more beta and gamma. Beta and gamma are the high-speed oscillations. And purple is what we actually found. And we were not correct about the low-speed brain activity. That is not different. But we were correct in our hypothesis about beta and gamma. And so that test is super exciting because this is still RCT, experimental. It's hard to come up with what the confounds are. It's only a subset of the children at age 12 months, but we are seeing more of the higher hertz, the higher oscillations in brain activity, which in correlational studies predict to later improved school readiness outcomes. So we don't know, that's not a super robust literature, but it gives us hope that we might actually be seeing something at age 4. I'm gonna move quickly now. We did have other measures at age 1, 2, and 3, where we didn't see differences. This is only maternal report, and I think one of the challenges in this work is always, because of COVID, we couldn't go in and do direct assessments. We were always asking moms how they were gonna report things, but we did not see differences in child behavior, health problems, whether they were meeting developmental milestones. We didn't see differences in breastfeeding. You can ask me about a lot of things in the Q&A because there's a lot of other data we had that I don't have time for. We did see differences in consumption of healthy food at age 2. So that is of interest. And just to remind everyone, when we started the study, we thought we might see differences at age 3. We're measuring these things at 12 months, at 24 months, at 48. And so our expectation was that we might see some differences, but that we might not see differences until the kids were older and growing up. So despite the many, nothing there, we're not sure that there is nothing there now or there won't be something there by age 6. And this is all the stuff you get to stay tuned for because we are collecting all of this, but we don't have it analyzed yet. So we're still in data collection mode. I'm gonna keep going. Actually, I'll stop there. I have some stuff to say about COVID. I have some stuff to say about discrimination. So some of our moms were ground zero of the George Floyd protests and murder, like literally in lockdown during that. So we can talk about that. And I'm just gonna put this up and open it up for questions because I realize I'm out of time. Sorry, I literally could talk about this for another 2 hours. And I know you don't want to listen to all that, so I'll stop. Yes?
What percentage of your families have EITC? Did any of your states have state-level EITCs? Do you have to use state dummies in all the analyses?
We do use state dummies in all of our analyses. Not all of them have it. I'm pretty sure Minnesota and New York have them, but not Nebraska or Louisiana. I can tell you this because we collected this data once we started realizing how important it was to tax file because it is also associated with receiving the CTC when it rolled out. 70% of the moms are on tax filing. So that doesn't tell us that they're all getting the EITC, but they all would be getting the EITC given their income brackets and ranges. Yeah, most would be eligible.
That would give them a bump of income generally.
Around April.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you might see some differences in how they're spending, or where they're spending, since they don't have how they're spending.
Yeah, and in fact, and I wish she was here, Sarah Halpern-Meekin, who is running our qualitative study, actually has written a book with Kathy Eden on the EITC and how people use the money and how they think about it. And so one of the questions she asks moms is how is this money different than EITC money, right? So which comes as a lump sum, is maybe less predictable or reliable because you don't know exactly how much you're gonna get, it's based on earnings. So in our qualitative data, we could say a lot about that, but I unfortunately don't know the answer to how the moms responded. Yes?
Did the one-year child allowance in any way confound any of this?
Yes and no. So it does not, the beauty of using a randomized control trial design is that we can still say something plausibly causal about differences between the groups that is attributable to the cash we have given them. So it doesn't mess up our internal validity. It does, however, draw questions, perhaps, with the external validity, right? So for a period of time, and we know what percent report getting it, so it's about 70% report having gotten the child tax credit. which was quite generous, right? So it was for young children, which is what we're talking about primarily in these families, it was $3,600 paid in part monthly. And if you had, unlike our gift, which is the same amount no matter how many children you had, if you had multiple children, you would get 36 times 2, 3, right? So that's, suddenly we're now talking about $9,000 or, quite a large amount of money. So we think about it changing the context a little bit about how people are thinking about the money, how they might be spending it, and what they might need it for. And I won't say that we were happy that it stopped, but it's this interesting confound in that for 6 months, in the middle of the period that they will have gotten the cash receipt, they were getting other large amounts of influx of money. Similarly, they report getting just the pandemic payments, right? For some of these mothers, $1,400 at once was quite a large sum of money. So all of that is part of the mix. It doesn't change our internal validity, but it does perhaps, might make people question, well, how do I generalize this to a time in which there wasn't $1,400 going out in pandemic payments and $3,600 going out in tax credit? There was a lot of interest from advocacy groups about our study findings, particularly around the EEG, because that was seen as evidence that cash support really could make a difference for children. So at the end of the 6 years, I guess we'll see. And we've collected data specifically on what payments moms have received along the way, because that's important to describe as well. Also, unemployment. People don't talk enough about the expansion of unemployment insurance that happened. So that's one of my slides. Thank you. COVID also happened, if anyone wants to talk about what COVID might have meant. Right? So it turns out all the lockdowns, stay-at-home orders were the same in the cities, so we couldn't do a neat experiment, rollout of different times to see how it might have differentially affected them. But we were asking people about how many households lost income, many, and actually more in the high cash gift report having lost household income. But they're also more likely to report receiving UI. And that UI federal benefit that rolled out was really generous, particularly for low-income workers. So yes, Laura, you have for a brow again. So many of them got the government aid at the same time, and everyone reported fairly significant changes to their behavior. So I think over 90%, like 95% of everyone said that they did socially isolate during COVID. Yes?
One question that's small, and that's about low birth weight, and if low birth weight infants were in this study, because it sounded like there was just one of the maternity wards, and how that might play a role. And then, if you can maybe give us a sense of how you and your colleagues are thinking about the results that are opposite to your hypothesis. Do you have some explanations that you're...
Yeah, thinking about. Thank you for both of those. So to be included in the study, the child had to be in the well-child nursery, which would really take out most significantly low birth weight children. Our average birth weight was 7 pounds. So we don't have a large number that are low birth weight. Like we have probably some 5.9 or 6 pound babies, but not very small. And yes, so we have spent a lot of time puzzling over our, and we sometimes disagree. Sometimes it's like, are they strong because they're all in the same direction, right? Which is against our hypotheses, or are they really just zeros? There's no differences. So we spent a lot of time talking about it, and we spent a lot of time talking to other researchers about it. There has been a study that came out, which was a pandemic benefit of 3 different levels. The largest was $2,500 unconditional cash that similarly found a sort of increase in stress in a negative way as a result of the particularly large cash gift. So here's what I can tell you is that we are not pushing mothers into sort of like bad mental health places, right? So this is like a modest increase, and overall the moms are reporting low levels of anxiety, relatively low levels of stress, which also might be surprising because I'm telling you that they're under economic strain and economic hardship. So those two things don't exactly jive, but they're not reporting very high levels of stress. So this is not a situation where we feel like, okay, we need to stop this, we're doing harm. is the first thing I would say. The second thing is, I think we've checked a lot of things empirically, like maybe they're getting more money and they're thinking that they can move out on their own, but that ends up being more stressful. So we don't see changes in household structure. We're not seeing large changes in relationship status. This isn't a circumstance where they're getting money and saying, well, I don't need you anymore, but then, things like that. So we looked into a lot of different things, and nothing is panning out. The other study makes an argument that by providing more resources, you open up more opportunities to people, and that then when they see more doors open, it can be stressful or overwhelming, right? The idea that there's more responsibility to do more, to spend the money in useful ways, and that can be stressful. When we talk to moms in the qualitative interviews, no one says the money is stressful or that they're feeling more anxious about the money, right? They think the money is, like some of them think it's not enough, or some of them think like, oh, it's only $20 because we're talking to both groups, like this isn't, this is not a big deal. But no one's like, oh, I would be better off without this money. So it's a puzzle, and we're gonna continue, we've had conversations, now everyone else wants to interrupt me, feel free. We've had conversations of like, if you have more money in your pocket, it's easy to go out and buy more food, right? Like you don't have to wait a couple of months for that to really change. Like maybe at age 6, we will see differences and reductions in stress. I'm not sure I'm in that camp. I think a lot of the things that mothers find stressful or are dealing with, some of them are money related, but not all of them, right? And so it may simply be that this amount of money doesn't really demonstrably improve these types of outcomes for this population. That's like a lot of if, then, buts, but you get what I'm saying. Yes?
Moving on from that, did you find that they were anxious about the money ending? And do you have some kind of, it feels almost kind of mean to set them up like that, because those are crucial years, and then just take it away, and it's not a huge amount, but it's important to them.
Yeah, no, we haven't heard, so we've had mothers say like, oh, it's gonna be harder, or I'm gonna have to figure stuff out, but we don't hear them actively sort of saying, I'm really worried about that. And I think part of it is, like for many of these families, like income isn't just a regular, like what's unique about this money is it is regular and reliable, and they are used to a lot of fluctuations from getting jobs, losing jobs, benefit hassles, all this other stuff. And I have the conversation early on when we were planning of, just because they're gonna lose it doesn't mean you wouldn't ever wanna not give that to them, right? Because then you wouldn't give anything to anyone. So I think it's a balance. And we certainly work really hard at communication. So they know we have both participant newsletters where we update people on the study, and we text them about the money every time it's loaded. And so we have a plan of making sure that they know when it is finally stopping. Yeah. Yes?
So I was thinking the gap, so objectively, the experimental group is better off, but subjectively, they kind of like worse off. So is there literature pointing to this gap between subjective perception of economic status and objective, like at that level?
Not much. And I will say, like a place to look also is there's a lot more unconditional cash transfer randomized controlled trials that have been done in developing countries. Yeah. And there are certainly studies that show no differences, like not improved, but none that show negative. And we aren't showing negative, we're showing, but they're all moving in that direction. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for such a great talk. I'm curious, for you as the PI of the study, and your early findings have gotten so much press and attention.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that people are interested in asking like what the policy implications are, like what recommendations you make based on the findings that you have so far, especially some of these, kind of interesting or maybe surprising findings. And I'm curious what you say at this point.
I try and duck those questions, I think, at this point. No, that's not true. So I think, we try to be really, really careful, because I will say one of the primary narratives about how money helps families is by reducing stress. And this is in part the success of Jack Shankoff's Toxic Stress is Bad for Kids, for anyone that's in the early childhood space. And we think we see early glimmers of money is good for kids, and it may not be through the subjective well-being of mothers improving, subjective, not, right? But that still seems to be such a strong narrative. So personally, and as PIs, we come down in different ways of saying things. I think we really need the age 4 data to give us more information. I feel like from an empirical evidence perspective, it looks promising, but not yet super clear what the money will do for kids' outcomes. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I know that's a ducking question. Yes?
Are you planning to track, you might have said this, are you planning to track the kids longer past the end of the cash payments? Like, will you have school?
Yeah, so we're tracking them, we're bringing them into the lab at age 6 and at age 8. Age 8 will be past age 6. We are asking mothers for consent to get school records at age 6. Has anyone in the room ever done this? It is so challenging because every school district has a different policy, and it's not, so I literally am saying to my co-PIs, I was like, we better have a lot of money because it takes a lot of staff, because they started out very closely, they started out all in the same cities, but they've actually moved. Like, we have a mom in Vegas, we have a mom in St. Louis, and then if you go to somewhere like New Orleans, which it's not local-based elementary schools, it's all choice. So I'm not looking forward to that, but it's a really good idea, and we're going to try it anyway to follow them long-term and see. I think, and part of that will be contingent on what we see in the next few waves of data collection as well. Thank you. Oh, one more, final question.
Oh, sorry.
And anyone can leave. No offense, you can get up and leave.
You already talked this a bit, but I had a question about that intuitive findings. And I was wondering about like cursive lotto, where it just changes family dynamics. People are asking for money, they're not getting support.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, maybe they receive fewer support from partners and family, and they also gave some of that money.
Yeah, no, that's so and again, we can't get at this, we don't have a good way of getting at this through the quantitative data. I mean, they report what assistance they're getting from other people, and that hasn't really changed. The qualitative data is helpful, and what we find is mothers do not tell their extended networks about this card. Usually their partner will know, but they are very careful for exactly that reason. Like, they don't necessarily want people coming to them to ask them for money. So they're actually keeping it fairly narrow in terms of who knows. And there are network exchanges, but we are not hearing a lot about sort of using the money to help others. And in fact, they're kind of like not telling people about it purposely for that reason. Yeah. Because they see it as for the baby, again, right? And so, or some of them do.
I wanted to, there's one more, but as we're leaving, there is also a reception, so we'll just go that way for snacks.
Snacks are that way. Snacks are that way. So there's snacks. And you can take snacks and keep walking if that's what you want to do. Don't feel obligated.
But in the interest of making sure we're all here to thank you so much for your time and to tell us about this really cool study. Everybody, give it up.
Thank you. Who won the raffle, and what was the raffle for?
Oh, the raffle was for polo shirts that say Wasatch Front Research Data Center. I really wanted to win it. I did not win.
So here's your new colleague.
Awesome. Great.
This is from the Michigan website.
Okay, I'm going to turn this off so I'm not hot miking. All right, I will look for, and I will go home and ask my